Welcome to Sobol Says for Parshas Savo. We are now fully back in the saddle and back to our weekly video. As I'm sure most of you know, this week's Parsha is dominated by the brachos and the klalos, the blessings and the curses, which take up the vast majority of the Parsha. So in such an instance, we do that which is obvious. We speak about everything but that. So basically this Parsha, in sharp contrast to last week's Parsha, which was essentially an amalgam of mitzvos, has only three topics. Bikurim, the first fruits that the farmer would bring up to the Beis HaMikdash. Meiser Sheni, which is a related topic somewhat to Bikurim. And finally, the brachos and the klalos, including the peculiar intro to them in this Parsha via the blessings and curses that were declared on Har Grizim and Har Evel. And then finally, after the description of the klalos, there is a short 8-pasuk insertion that does not even qualify as a topic. Rather, it's the beginning of Moshe's swan song as he begins his final address to the people. It is almost awkwardly inserted into the Parsha, and it does not even seem to really belong over here. It's a non sequitur. Even more surprising, if you turn to page 1084, which is almost the very end, or perhaps actually it is the very end of the Parsha, you'll see that it begins a new parak. So pretty much the entire Parsha was complete, and then 8 psukim before the end, a new parak begins and has just this 8-pasuk miscellany, we'll call it. And that is very odd. The rest of it literally continues into next week's Parsha. And that's very unusual, though not unprecedented, for the Torah to start a parak right before the end of a Parsha, especially when it has no connection to the prior topic. On a simple level, we can obviously suggest that the Torah always avoids ending on a low note. The Torah does not want to end with the end of the klalos, so therefore it made sense to have an additional topic right after the curses, but perhaps we're going to be able to suggest a much deeper meaning than that as to why it specifically has to appear in this week's Parsha. So let's see. I noted there were only 3 real topics in the Parsha, dominated by the brachos and klalos, and of course the Bikurim and the Meiser Sheni, and therefore we won't speak about them. And so the only thing left for us to talk about is, you guessed it, these final 8 psukim at the end of the Parsha. But before that, we're going to come back to the topic of Bikurim as well. Don't worry about that. For a connection between it and the end of our Parsha. But first, let's start off by turning to those last 8 psukim that we've been referring to, that are the beginning of Moshe's farewell speech. So it's on page 1084, psukim 1 to 8. So Moshe begins his soliloquy by listing some of the highlights of the desert experience that led up to the final days with Moshe. You can read them on your own. We will reference a number of them throughout. Moshe lists the fact that Bnei Yisrael's clothing and shoes never wore out in the desert, nor did they need to have bread or wine because they had the man, and that they were able to be victorious over the mighty kings Sichon and Og. And then he ends off with the description of the tribes of Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh getting their land and settling in it in Transjordan, on the other side of the Jordan. The very last Rashi in the Parsha, I guess we'll begin at the end, on the pasuk describing the conquest of Sichon and Og and the 2.5 tribes settling in their land, quotes the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which says, you've seen all these great things, and then it says, and God did not give you heart to know. He did not give you understanding until today. She'ein adam omed al sof daito shel rabo v'chachmas mishnaso ad arbaim shana. Rashi quotes the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which tells us that a student does not fully appreciate or understand his Rebbe's teachings until 40 years later. The obvious question, of course, is why does Rashi tell us that here? I mean, I understand maybe he realized like, wow, I need to fill up a little bit of space. My editor, needs me to complete X amount of words. So I'm going to throw in a few fun facts and miscellany. That's not the way Rashi operates. Rashi is telling us a very on point and relevant statement by quoting that Gemara. So the question is, what is he trying to tell us and why is it over here? And also, if you're going to list highlights of the 40-year sojourn in the desert, as Moshe does in this list, and he talks about the great trials that we beheld and the great signs and the wonders, and Hashem took us out of Egypt, etc., etc. He spoke about the clothing not wearing out, the bread and the wine not being needed. Okay, those all sound like things one would list in the highlights of the desert experience. But then there's one that is listed that would probably not make anyone's top 10 list. We can understand the miracles of the clothing, the food, even the incredible victories over those mighty kings. But the settling in the Transjordan by the 2.5 tribes, that's a highlight. I mean, Moshe is not just like going off of memory. Let's talk about a few things that happened. Moshe is delivering to Bnei Yisrael the beginning of his farewell speech, and he specifically lists certain events that occurred up until this point. Well, one of them that he highlights is the fact that the 2.5 tribes settled in the Transjordan. Why would that be a highlight? So I once heard from Rabbi Frand, who brings this down from the Sefer Shemoneh Tov, a fascinating insight. Why does Rashi tell us this adage at this point, that a person does not fully appreciate the teachings of their Rebbe until 40 years later? Well, let's think about what happened with the 2.5 tribes. Moshe comes to the people, and he says, I'm giving these 2.5 tribes their land now, from the land we've just conquered. Okay? They get it right now. The rest of us are going to travel to Israel, and we're going to do battle with 30 kings and 7 nations. And then after we conquer them, the rest of you will get your land. Yes, the men from those 2.5 tribes are going to accompany us and fight with us, but the women and the children of those tribes will stay and settle in and get to set up their homes now. Now, knowing B'nai Yisrael's M.O., I mean modus operandi, not modern Orthodox, what would we expect them to say? We would say, wait a minute, Moshe, not so fast. Let's not go around giving anything away just yet. Let's first enter Israel as you spoke of. Let's have the battle. Let's see exactly how much land we get. Perhaps we're going to not be successful at all, or perhaps we'll be somewhat successful. We're not going to get as much real estate as you promised, and therefore we may need to dip into that land as well. So hold your horses, Moshe. Let's see what happens, and then we'll make this decision. But in fact, what happens? In fact, he says it, and they accepted it. If Moshe said that Hashem said they would be successful and conquer the land, then they could bank on it. Look at what a change in the people over the course of those 40 years. They went from complaining the second words came out of Moshe's mouth to, Rebbe, if you tell us that's the way it's going to be and that's the proper way, then we accept it. You will not hear from us any further. That is why Rashi brings down that Gemara here. And that's why this event is so noteworthy to Moshe. Because in fact, Rashi is telling us that after 40 years in the desert, the people finally got it. They finally understood They finally understood the teachings of their Rebbe, of Moshe Rabbeinu. They finally learned how to trust him because he was the servant of Hashem, and therefore they understood that they had to trust Hashem regardless of surroundings, regardless of the way things appeared. If Hashem said it was so, then it was so. Now it's interesting because with Bikurim, there's a fascinating medrash. It says that when the farmer would take those first fruits up to the Beis HaMikdash, a baskol, a heavenly voice would come out and say, just as so-and-so, the name of the farmer, brings Bikurim this year, so too shall he bring Bikurim next year. Now that's got to make you feel pretty good, right? It's a very tough mitzvah, and we're going to discuss it a little later on. But when you get a voice from heaven telling you, attaboy, you're doing the right thing. Just like you did it this year, you're going to survive the entire year and do it again next year. That puts the winds in your sails. That really motivates you. And if you're wondering, by the way, the Sfas Emes actually asks a question on this medrash. You may be wondering how it was that farmers ever died in those days, because if they would bring their Bikurim and a baskol would say that they're going to do it again next year, then I think that means they're going to be around next year. So how did anyone die? The Sfas Emes actually says the baskol, in case you're wondering, it's off our topic, but the baskol would come every other year. One year it would say it, that following year it would not say it, and then the following year again it would, because otherwise, frankly, what's the big deal? You know, it's one thing when you're making a sacrifice, but when you're making a sacrifice and God's telling you you're doing a great job, I mean, it's not nearly as hard to do it under those circumstances. And that brings us back to this situation with the Rebbe, because we don't have a baskol anymore. We don't have God telling us, you're doing a great job. We don't have any of those miracles. We don't have any of those external things telling us what we should or shouldn't be doing. However, we do have Rabbeim. We do have Chachamim, our sages. They are here to guide us in that respect. And that is why this tells us we need to listen to our Chachamim. And that we might not even understand what they're telling us. You know, but what do? We don't like this idea of having to look to Rabbeim for guidance, to look to the Chachamim for guidance. Why? We like to brush aside such advice because we jealously guard our independence. I know what I'm doing. I don't need some other guy to tell me what's the right or wrong way. I'm an adult. I see the world around me. I understand right and wrong. We don't like that because this belies our independence. And therefore, what do? We often find fault in the Chachamim, in the Rabbeim. Why? Because if we can do that, then we can justify blowing off their advice and doing whatever we want, right? Because this guy, he has this problem, he has that problem, this guy lied about this guy, yeah. Why are we really saying, all of a sudden, you're such a purveyor of justice? Each one of us holds such a strict justice for people? No, we do it with the rabbis, because if I can some way discount that rabbi, then I can discount having to listen to him, and then I'm free to do whatever I want. That is a problem that we have. And what do we claim? And the Chumash itself, the Torah itself, anticipates this by telling us the shofet in your day, that you have to listen to the judge who's in your day. Says Rashi famously on that, because the judge that you have in your day is like Shmuel was in his day. That we get the judges appropriate for us. Because our tendency is to say, if only we had the Chavetz Chaim now, if only the Vilna Gaon was here, then I would never sin. I would never do anything wrong. Those guys were guys properly. But who are we stuck with now? Much lower level. It reminds me, my chavrusa, Rabbi Yitzchak Salad, told me a story about a Rav Yankelowitz. I think this was like in the middle of the 20th century, and he was one time giving Musar to a kehila, to a congregation, and there was a heckler there, and he was like, why aren't the rabbis nowadays as great as they were in the old days? If they were great like that, then we would listen to you. And Rabbi Yankelowitz responded the following. He said that the people are like milk, and the leaders are like the cream on top. And that analogy makes perfect sense to us. We are the mass, we are the milk, they are the cream on the top. said Rabbi Yankelowitz. When the milk is spoiled, the cream doesn't taste so great either. And that is the best Musar of all. In other words, he's telling us the level of our leaders often are a reflection of us. It's not vice versa. It's not that we're low because we have low leaders. We have low leaders because we are low. And I'm not chas v'shalom disparaging any of our Gedolei Hador now, but obviously it's all relative. We go down, they come down with us. We go up, they go up with us. We get a reflection of ourselves. So perhaps we should focus more on our own shortcomings instead of focusing on the shortcomings or the apparent shortcomings of the Chachamim in order to do what we really want to do, which is whatever we want to do. And it's a mistake, especially since we now know that we may not even fully understand what they're saying to us. It's easy to dismiss it when you don't understand it. Rashi anticipates it, and Rashi tells us from the Gemara. Could be 40 years later is the first time you start to understand anything that your Rabbeim told you. And if you honestly reflect on things that were told to you many years ago, things we may have dismissed at the time, we most likely will now see the wisdom in a lot of them. You know, our teachers get much smarter the older we get. So, that brings us back to the Parsha of Bikurim. But before we get there, let's look at one more interesting aspect of these last 8 psukim, and then we'll be able to move on, or move backwards actually. On page 1084 again, psukim 1 to 3. So now we'll just read them inside. Vayikra Moshe al Kol Yisrael vayomer alehem atem risim es kol asher asa Hashem le'einechem be'eretz Mitzrayim Faro u'chol avado v'chol artzo hamasos hagadolos asher ro einecha hausos v'hamofsim hagadolim hahem v'lo nasan Hashem lachem lev ladas ve'inayim liros v'aznayim lishmoa ad hayom hazeh. So Moshe summons all of Israel and he says to them, you've seen everything Hashem has done before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Paro and to all his servants and to his land, the great trials your eyes beheld, great signs and wonders. But Hashem did not give you a heart to know, or eyes to see, or ears to hear until this very day. Again, a reflection of the fact that we didn't understand truly what was happening. But here's an interesting thing. The Rashi on Pasuk Gimel, Lo nasan lahem, that Hashem did not give to you lev ladas, a heart to know, an understanding. Says, L'hakir es chastei HaKadosh Baruch Hu u'ledavek bo. It's to recognize the chesed that Hashem did for us this whole time, and to cling to us, and to cling to it. In other words, it's telling us that up until this time, Bnei Yisrael was unable to fully appreciate all the chesed Hashem had been doing for them the past 40 years, and only now could they begin to realize the greatness of what was done, and how all this had miraculously come from Hashem. Then Moshe begins the list of all the things that Hashem had done for us in the desert. Oddly, when it comes to Pasuk Vav, the 6th Pasuk, it is a very strange Pasuk. It says, "Vatavo el hamakom hazeh, vayetze Sichon melech Heshbon v'og melech Habasham l'krasenu lamilchama v'nakem." You came to this place, then you arrived at this place, and Sichon, king of Heshbon, and Og melech Habasham went out toward us to do battle, and we smote them. The Maharal, in his Sefer Gur Aryeh, the Gur Aryeh is a super commentary. It's a commentary on Rashi. So a commentary on a commentary is a super commentary. So he is bothered by 2 things. The first is, why does that pasuk need to start Vatavo el hamakom hazeh, and you came to this place? That is completely unnecessary. That is superfluous. It could have just said that you defeated Sichon and Og. You did battle with Sichon and Og, and you defeated them. What are these introductory words, and you came to this place for? We know the Torah never puts a single dot that is not necessary. The second question he asks is, was it really necessary for Moshe to tell Bnei Yisrael that they had no part in these wars, right? If you look, it says that we went out to do battle, and what did Rashi tell us? That he was saying to them, this was all chesed that Hashem did for you. Okay? In other words, that's a very nice way of saying that we really had nothing to do with this at all. It was all Hashem. Now, that is something we know, of course. But the question that he asks is, was it necessary for Moshe to tell Bnei Yisrael that they had no part in the wars that were fought and won, that everything was a miracle from Hashem? True, of course, Hashem pulled all the strings to give us the victory, but no credit at all to Bnei Yisrael for fighting the wars? So the answer, says the Maharal, can be found in the Pasuk. The Torah speaks specifically of the wars with Sichon and Og because those were overt miracles that were undeniably the hand of God. Now, obviously, let's understand, everything is the hand of God. Some things are more overt than others. Israel, in modern day, has fought a lot of wars, each of which were miraculous, but none could probably stack up to the Six-Day War. That was an overt miracle. That was a miracle that not a single person in the world could say was anything else. You know, if the bookmakers in Vegas were putting odds before that war, $1 and you would be a multi-millionaire. They would have given you any odds. That was an overt miracle in every way you slice it. An impossibility. So, same with Sichon and Og. That was a war that was an overt miracle. And therefore, the Pasuk starts off, right? Hashem obviously had his hand in that one. But the Pasuk starts off, Vatavo el makom, that you came to this place. Says the Maharal, that is the credit we're getting. We showed up. We showed up. That's a very big deal, especially when you're looking at a potential slaughter. Right now, Israel in the Six-Day War was in an existential battle. But nonetheless, soldiers showed up. They didn't run. They showed up. That's very powerful. Because what Moshe is saying is that we had the Amunah in Hashem. We had the Amunah to show up. And that's what is amazing about us. That's what was laudatory. Not at all is Moshe saying that we had no part in the victory. In fact, we had the one part that makes all the difference. We showed up. The Torah gives Bnei Yisrael credit. Otherwise, it could have just said what? Hashem brought us to this place. It doesn't. It says that you came to this place. You did it, Bnei Yisrael. And that's what you're going to get credit for. That's what Hashem needs from you. You're not going to decide the results. You'll never will. But you show up. That's the most important thing. We have to do our hishtadlus. But lest we think it's through our efforts that we find success, the Torah is reminding us that it all comes from Hashem. That is the dichotomy that we are faced with, and one that must guide us at all times. The balance between our efforts, our hishtadlus, and the results that seem connected to them. I'm a recovering attorney, and I could tell you back in my early days of my career, that was a very tricky thing to do, because if you charge by the hour, the obvious understanding is, well, the more hours I work, the more money I'm going to make. It's a very simple arithmetic. If I work 8 hours, I can bill 8 hours. I'm going to make X amount of dollars. If I work 12 hours, I'm going to make much more. So at what point is it no longer my efforts? At what point am I supposed to say my efforts are enough? And now it's Hashem that's going to take control. So in order to better understand how to look at the interplay between these two seemingly or somewhat contradictory ideas, I like to use a particular halacha to illustrate it. And that's to illustrate the tension between Ein Somchen al Hanes, not relying on a miracle, and our efforts and the effect they have on the results. Right? Because we understand, can't sit home all day twiddling your thumbs and expect that you're going to make a parnasa. So how does that work exactly? So there's a halacha that tells us that we must stand for the Shmona Esrei. If you do not stand, other than in certain exceptions due to illness or the like, but 99.999% of the time, you must stand when you say Shmona Esrei. That's why it's called the Amida, because you have to stand. That's what you have to do. And if you do not stand, you have not discharged your obligation to say the Shmona Esrei. Now, one is allowed to lean on something when they say Shmona Esrei, such as a shtender. and still be considered standing, unless you're leaning too heavily on the shtender. What is the test? What is the litmus test? So if someone would quickly pull away the shtender and the person would still remain standing, then they're considered to be standing. But if they pulled it away and they would fall over, then their Shmona Esrei is invalid, since they are not considered to be standing. So too our reliance on Hashem. We must lean, because that is really where it's coming from. But we can't lean so heavily that if they pulled away, we would fall down. We do need to make our efforts. So coming back to the beginning of the Parsha, I wanted to suggest there may be a connection between the Maharal's thoughts that we just discussed and the mitzvah of Bikurim mentioned at the beginning of the Parsha. The mitzvah of Bikurim is one of great emunah. Here the farmer has worked the land, he's plowed, sowed, toiled, etc. And finally, after so much effort and hard work, the proverbial and literal first fruits of his labor are realized. The Torah commands that he take those first fruits and bring them to the Beis HaMikdash, to the Kohen, and give them over. So at that pivotal moment, the farmer must make a choice. He sees that beautiful first fruit glistening in the sun that he has worked months and months for, till finally it's ready. And he says, do I keep these fruits and thereby say that it was through my efforts that these fruits came about? Or do I bring them to the Kohen and acknowledge that this was all from Hashem? Now understand, the mitzvah bikurim of first fruits is even harder than giving meiser, giving a percentage of your income. You know why? Because when you make that income, you could just set that aside and use that money right away. Or you can even just use the money right away and you owe that meiser. Bikurim is different. You don't get to partake in that fruit whatsoever. Your very first fruit, 100% to Hashem. Nothing to you. That is difficult. That is very difficult. Now, of course, he'll make the right choice. But are there any words of comfort in the Torah that will make him feel better? Because that sure takes a lot of oomph to do that. Perhaps going in line with what the Maharal said, the Parsha begins on page 1068. V'haya ki Savo el haaretz. It will be when you enter the land. Very similar to the language that the Maharal pointed out at the end of the Parsha. V'tavo el hamakom. It does not say when Hashem brings you into the land, but rather it says when you come into the land, when you enter into the land. Now sure, the pasuk continues that Hashem, your God, gives you as an inheritance in order to remind you where it all comes from. But the Torah sure gives an acknowledgement to the farmer for having the faith to show up and put forth the effort. You need to at least come into the land. You need at least to put forth those efforts. But, says Hashem, I'll take it from there. But you're going to get full credit because you put forth the efforts. You had the faith in me. And therefore, when you bring those bikurim, I am telling you, even though God says, even though it all comes from me, you get the credit because you put forth the effort. Like the old joke with the man, davening to win the lottery, and the punchline being that Hashem says, meet me halfway, buy a lottery ticket. That's exactly in line what this is talking about. But we must be careful, as we learn from the lesson of Bikurim, that we not tilt too far in the other direction and think our efforts in any way affect the results. Yes, Hashem says, you came, you tried, I've got it from here. But please don't think your actual efforts are what produced that fruit. The two must always go hand in hand. We must show up, we must make the effort, but we must not think our efforts are what bring about the results. As the Gemara in Megillah tells us, Hakol bidei shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven. Which brings us back to the beginning of our Parsha, to the topic of Bikurim, and even further back to the very end of last week's Parsha, which ended with the requirement to wage war against the Amalek and remember what they did to us. And speaking of war, let's go even further back to Parshas Shoftim, the one before last week's, and learn an interesting halacha. Then we will ask a series of questions on this and see if we can tie it all together. As you may recall, when speaking of men who were eligible to go to war, the Torah lists a number of exemptions. Someone was newly married, if they had just built a house, if they had just planted a vineyard. And finally, it also speaks of one who's frightened, somebody who's just scared. Any of those men are exempt from war and get to go home. There's an interesting and curious Gemara in the Gemara Sota, which discusses this last exemption. I'm just going to read it for you briefly, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah says, V'yasfu ashotrim ledaber al ha'am, and the officers shall say to the nation. Now, if you learn a lot of Mishnahs and Gemara, you'll know the one frustrating thing about it sometimes is that they will quote a pasuk, but they quote the part of the pasuk that has nothing to do with what they're talking about. They're assuming you actually know Kol Torah Kula, you know all the pasuk, and therefore they didn't see it necessary to add in the rest of the words. However, it's not those words that matter, it's the rest of the pasuk, which I'll tell you in English. They then say, who is the man who's frightened and faint of heart? Let him go and return to his house, and let him not melt the hearts of his brethren like his heart. In other words, it's saying we can't have somebody out on the battlefield who's going to freak out of fear. Because if he starts freaking out and runs away, it's going to devastate the morale of the entire army. Once you see people running, everybody starts running. So therefore, the Torah exempts him. But what is the true meaning of this pasuk? So Rabbi Akiva tells us, Kimashmo. Rabbi Akiva tells us, it's the exact plain meaning that you would think it means. He's unable to stand in the battle phalanx and gaze upon an unsheathed sword. In other words, it's not for everybody. He can't handle that. That's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yossi HaGalili has a different understanding. Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says, Hayare v'rach halevav, who is frightened and faint of heart, Zeu hamisyari min ha'avera shebiyado. This is one who is fearful on account of his sins. Lefichach, therefore, Tosa lo haTorah es kol elu sheyaksur biglalan. Really, it's talking about somebody who's fearful that they have sins on their account, so to speak, and they will therefore not merit to survive the war. So because of that, they're afraid. It's not that they're afraid of war per se. They're afraid that they lack the merits with which to protect them in war. Therefore, they're exempted. Says Rabbi Yossi HaGalili an unbelievable insight into the sensitivity of the Torah. The Torah, he says, listed those other exemptions, one who built a new house, planted a vineyard, just got married. Why? As cover for the guy who's embarrassed because he may not be worthy. It's amazing. Because of that, we gave others exemptions. Why? So when he says, I'm going home, he doesn't have to, people don't assume it's because he's a sinful guy. Maybe he built a new house. Maybe he just planted a vineyard. Whatever the case may be. Unbelievable sensitivity of the Torah. Finally comes Rabbi Yossi, not Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. He also says it's due to fear of sin, but he lists specific sins. If it's somebody who is in an illicit marriage, such like a divorcee with a Kohen, and things of that nature, or a daughter or a Bas Yisrael to a Mamzer, etc. Somebody who's in that kind of marriage are that's the sins that the Torah is speaking of. Those are the three opinions. Says the Gemara, the obvious question, Ma'ika ben Rabbi Yossi, the Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. So what's the difference between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yossi HaGalili? They both say it's on account of fear of sin. Okay, so Rabbi Yossi had listed the actual sin. What's the difference between his opinion and Rabbi Yossi HaGalili? The difference between them is a rabbinic avera. If the person transgressed not a deoraisa, not something from the Torah like an illicit relationship that's listed in the Torah, but rather a mitzvah, an avera d'Rabbanan, one of rabbinic origin. So Rabbi Yossi HaGalili holds that even in that situation, fear of those types of sins would be enough for him to exempt himself from war. And oh, by the way, what is this sin, this rabbinic sin that Rabbi Yossi HaGalili is referring to? Says the Brisa, Sach ben tefila letefila, Avera hi biyado v'chozer aleh me'orchei hamilchama. What is this terrible sin that he's done? He spoke in between putting on his tefillin shel yad and his tefillin shel rosh. That is avera darabanan, that's not from the Torah, that's from the rabbis, and therefore he returns on account of that. Now let me ask you something. If you were going to list an avera that would be bad enough for someone to feel that their protection is no longer there, would it have been that? I mean, just to give you a basic summary, the difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim when it comes to, or one of the primary differences, when it comes to tefillin, it's based on a machlokas between Rashi and Tosfos, is whether we need to say one bracha or two, whether one bracha covers or not. Sephardim only say one bracha. Ashkenazim say two. They say laniach tefillin on the shel yad, and they say al mitzvah tefillin on the shel rosh. However, in a nod to the fact that perhaps really that second bracha is unnecessary because it's a question as to whether those are two separate mitzvos or a single mitzvah. Therefore, Ashkenazim, after they say the bracha al mitzvah tefillin keseder every morning, say Baruch Shem K'vod Malchus Olei Olam Va'ed, as if it were a possible bracha lebatala. When you would say, when you would inadvertently say a bracha that you're not supposed to, you say Baruch Shem afterwards to so-called erase it. So in this instance, that's what Ashkenazim do out of concern that maybe we should only say one bracha. But everybody would agree that if you spoke in between putting on your shel yad and your shel rosh, then you have to make a second bracha. No question about it. Now, you are not allowed to talk in between those two, though. That is a big no-no. But that's the sin that they're talking about, that you need to be afraid of, so much so that you're exempted from war if you've committed that sin. So we're going to return to that. Now moving forward, we ended off last week's Parsha with the war against Amalek and remembering what they did to us. And as we have done many times in this class, we want to focus on juxtaposition. Let us focus on juxtaposition for a moment. We've said many times, Rashi and other commentators, as well as the Gemara, often analyze the juxtaposition of two topics in the Torah. It always begins something like, Lama nismacha Parsha blank, la Parsha blank. Why is this Parsha talking about this topic juxtaposed or next to this Parsha talking about this topic? And then from that, we learn out many things. Now, we're talking about non-historical things, right? Anything in the Torah that's an obvious sequence or that's a related topic, they don't ask the question on that. But when you have two disparate topics, such that there seems to be no compelling reason that they should be next to each other, that's when we ask the question, and that's when we try to understand precisely what we can learn from the fact that they are juxtaposed to each other. So a number of Mefarshim ask why the Parsha of Amalek at the end of last week's Parsha is juxtaposed to the Parsha of Bikurim that's at the beginning of this week's Parsha. I mean, I know to us it seems like they're separate, but in the Torah they're right next to each other. What can we learn from that? So a number of answers are given, but we're going to attempt our own. But before we do that, let's see why it's an even better question than one might think. And that is because there is a surprising connection between Amalek and Bikurim. And in order to understand that, let's review a very famous Rashi on the very first pasuk of the Torah, which is based on a medrash. I don't need to tell you what page that is. It's obviously page 2. I've spoken before why everything starts on page 2. Maybe we'll revisit that again someday. But for right now, just be content in knowing it's the very first Parsha, a very first Rashi in the Torah. Parshas. It's actually, I take it back, it's not the first Rashi, it's a Rashi on the very first pasuk. And it's on the words Parshas bara. The question that Rashi, as many commentators ask, is why does the Torah start with the words Parshas bara, as opposed to a more common word like barishona in the beginning, or batchila, whatever it is. Bereshis is an unknown terminology. We see the word rashis in it, of course, which would mean first, rosh, etc., but very unusual. So the commentators ask, why does the Torah start with the word bereshis? And Rashi says, Eina mikra hazeh omer ela dorsheni. Rashi, in a very unusual poetic language, says this pasuk is basically begging for us to expound it. Bereshis bara, that's such an unusual terminology, it's begging us to give you commentary on such a thing. What does Rashi tell us? I'm not going to read the Rashi inside, but it's based on a medrash. Rashi tells us that the word, based on that medrash, that the word bereshis is a contraction of two words, bishvil rashis, for the sake of rashis, for the sake of things that are called rashis. Now, rashis means first, but it really means primary also. It can be used as either first or primary. You know, Rosh Hashanah, for instance, that's upcoming. See the word Rosh in there as well. Rosh Hashanah is the head, the beginning, the first of the year, but it's also in many ways the primary day of the year, in that it sets the tone for the rest of the year. Nonetheless, it was created the world for things called rashis, bishvil rashis. Rashi only lists a couple of examples, like Torah. Torah is called rashis, and then he gives us a pasuk as to that source. Yisrael is called rashis, gives a source for that as well. The Medrash, on the other hand, gives a much longer list. Maybe because Rashi was just starting out with his commentary, he didn't know how much space he was going to have, so he wanted to save some room. One of the shockers that it lists in the Medrash is Bikurim. Now, that's shocking simply because one would not think that that mitzvah is a top 10 reason why Hashem would create the world, right? I get it. Beautiful mitzvah. Hard to do mitzvah. Reason why God created the world? Not so much. Hard to understand that. And why is it called rashis? We know it. It's from this week's Parsha, as it starts. Vayaki Savo, the second pasuk says, "V'lakachta me rashis kol pri adama," and you will take from the first of every fruit. It's called rashis, bishvil rashis. But there's an even bigger shocker in that list, and that is that Amalek is also referred to as rashis. And therefore, the Medrash is telling us the world was created for things called rashis, and one of the things that are called rashis are Amalek, believe it or not. Now, why that is, we're not going to go into today, but obviously they are rashis, the primary, in terms of the enemies of God, so to speak. So they have a special status, and their defeat is the greatest Kiddush Hashem possible, so that would be a reason why. Nonetheless, we see that the juxtaposition is intensified between Bikurim and Amalek simply by the fact that they are both called rashis. So now let's review our questions and see if there's a lesson we can extract from all of them. What is the message the Torah is giving us by telling us that someone who speaks between donning his tefillin shel yad and his shel rosh should be fearful and not go into war? The second, why are the Parshios of Bikurim and Amalek juxtaposed, and what can we learn from the fact that they are both called rashis? As you'll recall, we learned from the Maharal that we got credit for showing up at the wars of Sichon and Og, but that we should not think our efforts affected the results. Based on that, we can begin our analysis by bringing an answer from the Tolner Rebbe as to why the Gemara chooses the example of talking between the Shel Yad and Shel Rosh. He says, that is the reason why the Talmud cites a person who spoke between putting on the hand tefillin and the head tefillin as the example of one who returns home from battle due to being afraid of his averos. The tefillin shel yad, the hand tefillin, represent the attitude of the strength of my hand. Kochi uve'etzem yadi, the idea that it is my might that does everything, my efforts that do everything. It is the head, the brain, which has to rein in such a philosophy of life. The head, obviously in this case, representing not just the intellect, but spirituality. The head has to rule over the hand. One who pauses between donning the hand tefillin and the head tefillin believes that there can be a separation between the two, as we spoke about last week with the mobsters. He believes that there can be a time when the philosophy of the hand rules by itself without being reined in by the philosophy of the head. Such a person indeed must retreat from the battlefield. In other words, what he's saying, the second we separate the hand from the head, the second we start to think hand's got its strength, head's got its strength, hand can do things on its own, that's when we need to be afraid, because that is the way of saying that by separating the hand from the head, the idea that our efforts cause the results. And that can be seen through Amalek and Bikurim as well. As we mentioned last week, Amalek equals Safek. They're each gematria 240. Amalek sows doubt by suggesting Hashem created the world and then took off. And therefore, we are now on our own, and thus, of course, it's our efforts that create the results, not Hashem. And Bikurim, a fellow Rashis, could also cause Safek, doubt, as to whether it was your efforts that brought about that fruit or whether it was Hashem. That is precisely the test of Bikurim, and that is exactly why it follows on the footsteps of the Parsha of Amalek. Did we remember what Amalek tried to do? Do we remember they try to sow doubt in our minds that maybe it's us and not God that's running the show? Well, here you are now with that beautiful first fruit. What will you do with it? Will you acknowledge that it was Hashem that brought it about and therefore bring it to the Kohen without so much as a taste, not even a nibble? You don't even get to taste a drop of that fruit that you worked so long for, hundreds of hours toiling in the sun. You don't even get to take a taste. Or do you start to think, I worked really hard to bring about this fruit. I toiled. I slaved. Yes, God was involved too. It was good rains. But you know what? I also came up with this awesome irrigation system. And that was really amazing. And the soil I shipped in special for these fruits. I'm sure that had a lot to do with it also. Yeah, God and those things. It could happen. And that's a doubt we cannot afford. And that may very well explain not only why Amalek and Bikurim are connected, but why there is an emphasis on two things called Rashis. Because that in turn reminds us of another Rashis. And this one you should know, because it is something we are supposed to say every morning after Modeh Ani. We are supposed to say, Rashis Chachma Yiras Hashem. That the beginning of wisdom is the fear of heaven, the fear of Hashem. And before, when I quoted the Gemara in Megillah as a reminder that everything comes from Hashem, I did not give you the full quote. I tricked you. I just said, Hakol b'dei Shemayim, everything is in the hands of Hashem. And that's because it served my purpose at that time. However, the rest of the saying is, Hakol b'dei Shemayim, chutz miyiras Shemayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven. Fear of heaven is on you. Fear of God, that is your burden, not God to instill in you. And that is the lesson of the one who goes home from war, why Amalek and Bikurim are juxtaposed, and why there's an emphasis on Rashis. The suffix first introduced by Amalek may seep into your thoughts as you pick that first fruit. But those two Rashis, the Amalek and the Bikurim, must remind you of another Rashis. Rashis Chachma Yiras Hashem. The Rashis of wisdom is fear of Hashem, which in turn reminds you, Hakol b'dei Shemayim, chutz miyiras Shemayim, that everything, even those fruits that you are holding in your hands, are from heaven, not from your efforts. But of course, you need Yiras Shemayim, fear of heaven, to know something like that. Good Shabbos.